The crisp autumn air carried the sound of cheerful chatter and music from the house next door. Jim Rogers stood at his window, arms crossed, his jaw tight as he watched the stream of cars pulling into the driveway of the newly sold property. The Johnsons, he thought, lips curling into a sneer. They didn't waste any time throwing a party, did they? Jim's hand hovered over his phone, torn between ignoring the event and taking action. But as the volume from the music swelled and the sight of his neighbors laughing on the front lawn grated on his nerves, he made his decision. Dialing the police non-emergency line, he faked a tone of concern. "Yes, this is Jim Rogers from 548 Maple Drive. There's some kind of disturbance at the house next door. Too many people, music's way too loud. Could you send someone to take a look?" By the time the patrol car rolled up 20 minutes later, Jim was already standing on his porch, arms crossed like a self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood. He watched with smug satisfaction as an officer approached the Johnsons. "Good evening," the officer began. "We received a noise complaint about the party." Marcus Johnson stepped forward, a tall man in a sharp navy blazer, his expression calm. Beside him, his wife Angela offered a kind smile, though her eyes betrayed annoyance. "Good evening, officer," Marcus said, extending a hand. "I'm Marcus Johnson. We just moved in and thought it would be nice to host a small gathering to meet our new neighbors. Apologies if the music disturbed anyone. We'll turn it down right away." Angela chimed in, "We're so sorry for the inconvenience. It won't happen again." The officer nodded, visibly relieved by their cooperative attitude. "Thank you. Have a good evening." From his perch, Jim couldn't believe his eyes. That's it? He'd expected confrontation, outrage, maybe even a fine. Instead, the Johnsons had handled the situation with such poise that it made Jim's petty act seem petty. As the officer drove away, Marcus glanced toward Jim's porch. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Marcus offered a brief nod before returning to his guests, but it wasn't one of submission. It was one of quiet confidence, as if he knew exactly who had called the police and had decided it wasn't worth his time. Later that week, Jim sat in his favorite diner, gossiping with his longtime friend and neighbor Greg. "You know the new folks at 550? Jim began, stabbing his fork into a plate of overcooked eggs. Greg raised an eyebrow. "The Johnsons? What about them?" Jim leaned in conspiratorially. "They had some loud party the other night. Whole block could hear it. I had to call the cops just to get them to tone it down." Greg chuckled awkwardly. "Well, it was their housewarming. I stopped by for a bit. Seemed like nice folks. Marcus is some kind of big-shot businessman, and Angela runs a nonprofit. Didn't strike me as troublemakers." Jim scoffed. "Doesn't mean they belong here. This neighborhood used to have standards." Now he trailed off, shaking his head. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Maybe you should give them a chance, Jim. People change. Neighborhoods, too. Not always for the better," Jim muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. Meanwhile, Marcus and Angela were settling into their new home, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond their property line. In the evenings, after putting their 2 children to bed, they sat on the patio discussing life, work, and dreams for their family. "This neighborhood seems nice enough," Angela said, sipping her tea. "But I'm not blind to the looks we've been getting." Marcus sighed, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "It's nothing we haven't faced before. I'd hoped it'd be different here, but..." "But what?" Angela prompted gently. "I had an interesting moment at work today," Marcus said, setting his glass down. "One of the companies I'm looking to acquire? Turns out, one of their senior managers lives right here in the neighborhood. I haven't met him yet, but I've seen the name, Jim Rogers." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Jim Rogers? As in the man who's been glaring at us since day one? Seems like it." Marcus chuckled softly, but there was a sharp edge to his tone. "Let's just say I'm looking forward to our first official introduction." The introduction came sooner than Jim anticipated. On a dreary Wednesday morning, Jim sat in the conference room at his office, staring blankly at the agenda for the day's meeting. He'd heard rumors swirling about a potential acquisition, but details were sparse. As the door opened, all chatter ceased. A group of executives walked in, led by none other than Marcus Johnson. Jim's stomach dropped. Marcus, now clad in a tailored suit that exuded authority, took his place at the head of the table. His gaze swept over the room, pausing ever so briefly on Jim, who felt an icy wave of humiliation wash over him. "Good morning," Marcus began, his tone commanding yet warm. "As you all know, Johnson Capital has recently acquired this company. I look forward to working with each of you as we navigate this transition." Jim's hands clenched under the table. He couldn't reconcile the image of Marcus, the neighbor he'd tried to intimidate, with the man now standing in front of him, poised to shape the future of his career. The meeting proceeded smoothly, with Marcus outlining his vision for the company. But for Jim, every moment felt like a spotlight on his own inadequacy. As the team dispersed, Marcus approached Jim, extending a hand. "Mr. Rogers," Marcus said, his voice neutral but firm, "I believe we're neighbors." Jim forced a tight smile, his palms sweating. "Yes, we are. Small world." "Indeed," Marcus replied, his handshake firm. "Let's make it a productive one." Back at home, Jim paced the living room, replaying the encounter in his mind. He felt exposed, like every petty thought and action had been laid bare. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning the man he had become and how long he could keep pretending his narrow worldviews were enough to sustain him. The first cracks in Jim's armor had appeared, though he wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. Jim couldn't escape Marcus Johnson, not in the office, not in the neighborhood. It felt as though the man had invaded every corner of his life. Every step Jim took seemed to lead him face first into his own embarrassment. Monday morning was no different. Jim entered the office early, hoping to avoid interaction. As he settled at his desk, his phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Team meeting with Marcus Johnson, 9 a.m. He sighed, already dreading the next hour. When he walked into the meeting room, Marcus was already there, speaking animatedly to a group of employees. Unlike the stiff, corporate tone Jim expected, Marcus seemed at ease, joking about football and asking about everyone's weekend. The room erupted in laughter as Marcus recounted a story about his son trying to fix a toaster with a screwdriver. Jim slid into a seat at the back of the room, hoping to remain invisible. "Ah, Jim," Marcus called out suddenly, breaking through the chatter. "Glad you could join us. Come sit up front." The request froze Jim in place. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. "Oh, I'm fine back here," Jim muttered, gesturing vaguely toward his seat. Marcus smiled, unyielding. "Nonsense. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the agenda. Come on up." With no way to decline gracefully, Jim shuffled to the front, his cheeks burning. He could feel the weight of every gaze as he took the empty chair beside Marcus. Throughout the meeting, Marcus asked probing questions about the company's processes, finances, and goals. When it was Jim's turn to speak, his responses were stilted and uninspired. "Jim," Marcus said, leaning forward, "you've been with this company for a long time, haven't you?" Yes. About 18 years, Jim replied, his voice tight. "That's impressive," Marcus said, his tone genuine. "With that kind of experience, I'm sure you've seen it all. I'd love to hear more about your perspective as we move forward. Perhaps we can schedule some one-on-one time later this week." Jim managed a strained nod, feeling like a spotlight had been aimed directly at him. The meeting ended with Marcus thanking everyone for their contributions, but Jim felt anything but appreciated. That evening, Jim slumped on his couch, a beer in hand, the TV playing a game he wasn't watching. His thoughts kept circling back to Marcus. The man was maddening. No matter how much Jim wanted to dislike him, Marcus remained polite, composed, and worse, completely unbothered by Jim's previous behavior. The doorbell rang, interrupting his brooding. Jim frowned, not expecting anyone. When he opened the door, Angela Johnson stood there, holding a tray of cookies. "Good evening, Mr. Rogers," Angela said, her voice warm but firm. Jim blinked, unsure how to respond. "Hi. I know it's been a little awkward between us," Angela continued, handing him the tray. "But Marcus and I want to make sure we're starting off on the right foot with our neighbors. Consider this a peace offering." Jim stared at the cookies, then at Angela. She stood tall, her presence commanding, as if daring him to reject the gesture. "Thanks," he mumbled, taking the tray. Angela's gaze didn't waver. "I also wanted to say something, Mr. Rogers. It's clear you're not happy we moved in. I don't know why, and frankly, I don't need to. But I want you to know we're not going anywhere. So, you can either keep glaring at us from your porch, or we can try being neighborly. Your call." Before Jim could respond, Angela turned and walked back toward her house, leaving him standing in the doorway, holding a tray of cookies he didn't want but couldn't refuse. Days passed, and Jim's frustration only deepened. At work, Marcus continued to lead with energy and insight, earning the respect of employees across departments. Even Greg, who usually shared Jim's skepticism about any change, had nothing but good things to say. "You've got to admit," Greg said over lunch, "Marcus knows what he's doing. He's already streamlined 2 processes in my department. Saved us hours of work each week." Jim stabbed at his salad with unnecessary force. "Sure, if you like being micromanaged." Greg chuckled. "I don't think it's micromanaging to care about efficiency, Jim. Maybe you should give the guy a break." Jim grumbled something incoherent, unwilling to concede. Another encounter with Marcus came unexpectedly in the grocery store. Jim was in the canned goods aisle when he heard Marcus's voice. "Jim, fancy seeing you here." Jim turned slowly, plastering on a weak smile. "Marcus." Small world. Marcus held a basket filled with items for what looked like a family dinner. "How's your week going?" "Fine," Jim replied curtly, hoping the conversation would end there. But Marcus wasn't deterred. "You know," he said, picking up a can of tomatoes, "I've been meaning to ask, what's your favorite spot for pizza around here? My kids are dying to try the best place in town." The casual, friendly tone threw Jim off. There's Tony's on Main Street. It's decent." "Tony's," Marcus repeated, nodding. "Got it. Thanks for the tip." For a moment, Jim thought he saw genuine gratitude in Marcus's eyes, as though this small exchange was all he needed to feel welcome. As Marcus walked away, Jim felt a pang of something unfamiliar: guilt. The guilt grew heavier as Jim found himself cornered yet again, this time during a corporate dinner. Marcus had invited key staff members and their spouses to a local restaurant, an opportunity to build rapport outside the office. Jim had hoped to decline, but the pressure from colleagues was too great. The evening started pleasantly enough, with light conversation and laughter. But as the night wore on, Jim found himself seated directly across from Marcus. "So, Jim," Marcus said, refilling his water glass, "what's kept you at this company for nearly 2 decades?" Jim shrugged, his defenses rising. "It's a job. Pays the bills." "I get that," Marcus said, his tone easy. "But there must be something more. Passion for the work? A connection to the team?" Jim shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. I guess it's just familiar." Marcus smiled faintly, but there was a glint of something sharper in his eyes. "Familiarity can be comforting, sure, but it can also hold us back." The words hit harder than Jim expected, leaving him uncomfortably aware of the truths he'd spent years avoiding. That night, as Jim lay in bed, he couldn't stop replaying Marcus's words. Familiarity can hold us back. For the first time, Jim wondered if his disdain for Marcus wasn't about the man himself, but about the mirror he held up, forcing Jim to confront not just his biases, but his stagnation. The cracks in his armor widened, though Jim wasn't ready to acknowledge them. Not yet. Jim stood frozen in the conference room doorway, his palms clammy as he realized the meeting he had dreaded all week was already underway. Marcus was at the head of the table, mid-sentence, addressing a projection of quarterly performance metrics. The room was filled with senior managers, all nodding along as Marcus explained a new strategy to improve efficiency. "Ah, Jim," Marcus said, spotting him. "Glad you could join us. Come in." Jim muttered an apology and slid into the nearest empty seat, his shoulders hunched. He avoided Marcus's gaze, focusing instead on the paper in front of him, a list of action items he didn't fully understand. "As I was saying," Marcus continued, unperturbed, "we're aiming to identify redundancies and streamline processes across all departments. I'd like to start with the most experienced staff members to gain insight into what's working and what isn't." Jim's stomach tightened. He could feel Marcus's eyes on him as he spoke. "Jim," Marcus said, addressing him directly, "given your 18 years here, I'm sure you have valuable insights. Why don't you share one thing you think we could improve on?" The room went silent. All eyes turned to Jim, whose mind raced for an answer. His usual tactic of fading into the background wasn't an option. Well, Jim stammered, feeling the heat rise to his face. I suppose some of the reporting tools are outdated. They're a bit, cumbersome to use? Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's a good point. Outdated systems can slow everything down. Thank you, Jim. We'll add that to the list. The meeting moved on, but Jim felt humiliated. Marcus had done nothing overtly cruel, yet every interaction seemed to spotlight Jim's insecurities. Later that day, Jim received an email from Marcus's assistant. Marcus Johnson has scheduled a one-on-one meeting with you for tomorrow at 3 p.m. Jim stared at the screen, dread coiling in his stomach. He spent the next 24 hours imagining every possible scenario. None of them good. When the time came, Jim entered Marcus's office reluctantly. The space was bright and welcoming, with family photos on the desk and an abstract painting hanging on the wall. Marcus stood by the window, looking out over the city. Jim, Marcus said, turning to greet him. Have a seat. Jim sat stiffly in the chair across from Marcus's desk. I wanted to talk about your role here, Marcus began, sitting down. You've been with this company a long time, and that kind of institutional knowledge is rare and valuable. But I can't help noticing that you seem hesitant to engage in the changes we're implementing. Jim bristled. I'm just used to the way things have always been done. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze steady. I get that. Change is hard, but it's also necessary if we want to grow. And growth doesn't just apply to the company. It applies to all of us individually. Jim fidgeted, feeling cornered. Are you saying I'm not doing my job well enough? No, Marcus said firmly. I'm saying you have the potential to do more. To lead even, but that requires stepping out of your comfort zone. The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Jim didn't know how to respond. That evening, Jim found himself sitting in his garage, staring at an old photo album. One photo in particular caught his attention. A picture of him standing in front of the factory where he'd worked in his 20s, smiling proudly on his first day. He hadn't thought about that factory in years, not since it had nearly gone under. The memory came flooding back. The weeks of uncertainty, the fear of losing his job, and the relief when a last-minute investor had saved the company. For the first time, he wondered who that investor had been. The following week, Jim attended yet another team meeting led by Marcus. This time, Marcus was outlining plans for a mentorship program. I believe mentorship is one of the most effective ways to foster growth, Marcus said, looking around the table. We've all had someone who helped us along the way, whether we realize it or not. For me, it was my father. He taught me the value of hard work and resilience, even when times were tough. Jim's ears perked up. Marcus rarely spoke about his personal life at work, and something about his tone felt raw, unguarded. My father owned a small business, Marcus continued, but he always made time to help others. I remember one particular instance where he stepped in to save a factory that was on the brink of closing. He didn't know the workers personally, but he believed in the value of keeping jobs in the community. Jim's chest tightened. Could it be? After the meeting, he approached Marcus cautiously. That story you told, Jim began, his voice unsteady, about your father saving a factory. Where was that? Marcus frowned slightly, thinking, it was in Ohio, a small manufacturing plant. Jim's pulse quickened. Was the plant called Thompson's Industries? Marcus looked surprised. Yes. How did you know? Jim's face turned pale. He sank into the nearest chair, his mind reeling. I worked there, he admitted, back when it was in trouble. Your father. He saved my job. Marcus's expression softened. I had no idea. Jim shook his head, struggling to process the revelation. I didn't either, not until now. I owe your family more than I realized. That evening, Jim knocked on the Johnsons' door. Marcus answered, surprised to see him. Jim, Marcus said, stepping aside. Come in. Jim hesitated before speaking. I wanted to apologize for how I've acted since you moved in. I've been unfair to you and your family, and it wasn't right. Angela appeared in the hallway, her expression curious. I didn't realize, Jim continued, his voice thick with emotion, that your father was the one who saved my job all those years ago. I didn't realize how much I owed you, how much I still have to learn. Angela and Marcus exchanged a look their expressions softening. "We appreciate you saying that," Marcus said. "It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong." Jim nodded, his throat tight. "I'd like to start over, if that's all right." Marcus extended his hand, and for the first time, Jim shook it with genuine respect. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Marcus said, his tone warm. For the first time, Jim felt like he truly belonged. The tension between Jim and the Johnsons had dissipated, but the aftermath of his transformation wasn't as simple as he'd hoped. Guilt still lingered, mingled with the slow realization of how deeply his prejudices had affected not only his relationship with his neighbors, but also his standing in the community. For the first time in years, Jim began stepping out of his self-imposed bubble. He attended block parties, volunteered to organize neighborhood cleanups, and even joined a book club Angela had started. Despite these efforts, Jim couldn't shake the nagging feeling that his apology wasn't enough, that words alone couldn't make up for the harm he'd caused. One Saturday morning, Jim decided to take a step further. He knocked on the Johnsons' door, holding a stack of papers. Marcus answered, dressed in casual clothes, his expression one of pleasant surprise. "Jim," Marcus greeted. "What brings you by?" Jim held up the papers. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said about stepping out of my comfort zone. I want to help. I know Angela runs a nonprofit, and I was wondering if you could point me in the right direction to get involved." Marcus studied him for a moment, then smiled. "I think Angela would love to hear that. Come in." Angela joined them in the living room, her face lighting up when Marcus explained Jim's request. "That's wonderful," Angela said, gesturing for Jim to sit. "We've got a mentorship program for at-risk youth, and we're always looking for volunteers. Would you be open to that?" Jim hesitated, his usual reservations creeping in, but he forced himself to nod. "Yeah, I think I could do that." Angela leaned forward, her tone encouraging. "These kids need role models, people who can show them what's possible with hard work and determination. It won't be easy, but it's worth it." Jim swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. "When do I start?" 2 weeks later, Jim found himself in a community center, surrounded by teenagers who eyed him with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. "This is Mr. Rogers," Angela introduced him to the group. "He's here to share his experiences and answer any questions you have about careers, life, or anything else on your mind." The room was silent. Jim cleared his throat, feeling more out of place than he had in years. "Well," he began awkwardly, "I've worked in manufacturing for most of my life. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. I've learned a lot about perseverance and adapting to change." A boy in the back raised his hand. "What kind of change?" Jim hesitated. "Well, for starters, learning to admit when you've been wrong. That's probably the hardest lesson of all." The boy smirked. "Sounds boring." The group chuckled, and Jim felt the heat rise to his face. But then he saw Angela standing at the back of the room, giving him an encouraging nod. "It can be," Jim admitted, managing a small smile. "But it can also change your life." As weeks turned into months, Jim began to feel more comfortable in his role as a mentor. The kids warmed to him gradually, and he found himself looking forward to their sessions. One afternoon, Marcus stopped by the community center to check in. He found Jim sitting with a group of boys, explaining how to fix a leaky faucet using a diagram on the whiteboard. "That's handy," Marcus remarked, stepping into the room. The boys greeted Marcus enthusiastically, and Jim turned, grinning. Sometimes practical skills are the best way to connect with them. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "Looks like you're a natural." Jim shrugged, but the compliment meant more than he cared to admit. The real test of Jim's growth came unexpectedly during a neighborhood meeting. The community had gathered to discuss a proposed housing project that would include affordable units. Tensions were high, with many residents expressing concerns about property values and crime. Jim listened quietly at first, his gut instinct urging him to side with the dissenters. But as the arguments grew more heated, he found himself glancing at Marcus and Angela, who sat silently, their faces betraying a mixture of disappointment and resolve. Finally, Jim stood. The room fell quiet, surprised by his uncharacteristic boldness. "I've lived here a long time," Jim began, his voice steady but firm. "And I'll admit, I haven't always been the best neighbor. I've judged people before I got to know them. I've been afraid of change." He glanced at Marcus and Angela. "But change isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's exactly what we need. I think this project could bring new life to our community. And maybe it's time we start looking at what we can gain instead of what we're afraid of losing. The room buzzed with murmurs. Jim sat down, his heart pounding. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Greg, his longtime friend, stood up. "Jim's right," Greg said. "We can't call ourselves a community if we're not willing to grow." Slowly, others began to voice their support. By the end of the meeting, the project had been approved, though not without lingering grumbles. That evening, Marcus stopped by Jim's house. "I wanted to thank you," Marcus said. "What you did tonight, it mattered." Jim nodded, his expression serious. "I figured it was about time I started putting my money where my mouth is." Marcus smiled. "You've come a long way, Jim, and I'm glad to call you my neighbor." For the first time, Jim didn't feel like the words were empty. He was finally earning his place in the neighborhood, not by clinging to the past, but by embracing the future. Spring arrived, bringing fresh blooms and a sense of renewal to the neighborhood. Jim sat on his porch, a cup of coffee in hand, watching as the Johnson children played basketball in their driveway. Marcus and Angela stood nearby, laughing and cheering their kids on. The scene felt ordinary, yet it carried a warmth Jim hadn't realized he'd been missing in his life. It had been nearly a year since the Johnsons moved in, and so much had changed. Jim no longer avoided them or viewed their presence as an intrusion. Instead, they'd become an integral part of the community, and much to his surprise, his life. The mentorship program at the community center had become a cornerstone of Jim's week. The kids he once struggled to connect with now greeted him with enthusiasm, seeking his advice on everything from job applications to fixing their bikes. One day, as the session was wrapping up, one of the boys, Alex, approached Jim. "Mr. Rogers," Alex said, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to say thanks. I got into that apprenticeship program you told me about." Jim felt a swell of pride. "That's great news, Alex. You worked hard for it. You earned it." Alex smiled shyly. "I don't think I would have done it without your help." Jim ruffled the boy's hair, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "You're going to do great things, kid. Just keep believing in yourself." Back at work, Jim's relationship with Marcus had transformed. The initial awkwardness between them had faded, replaced by mutual respect. Marcus had taken Jim under his wing, pushing him to embrace leadership roles he'd previously shied away from. One afternoon, Marcus called Jim into his office. "Jim," Marcus began, gesturing for him to sit, "I've been impressed with the way you've stepped up this past year. You've not only adapted to the changes here, you've helped drive them." Jim shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I've just been doing my job." Marcus shook his head. "You've done more than that. You've shown growth, resilience, and a willingness to learn. That's the kind of leadership this company needs. Which is why I'd like to offer you a promotion, Senior Operations Manager." Jim stared at him, stunned. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Marcus said with a grin. A rare smile spread across Jim's face. "Yes, I'll do my best." "I know you will," Marcus replied, shaking his hand. The neighborhood continued to evolve as well. The affordable housing project Jim had supported was under construction, and the community had started embracing its new direction. One Saturday, the Johnsons hosted another block party, this time with Jim's help. He manned the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with neighbors who now greeted him warmly. Angela approached, holding a tray of drinks. "I never thought I'd see the day when Jim Rogers would be the life of the party." Jim chuckled, shaking his head. "Neither did I." She smiled, her tone turning serious. "You come a long way, Jim, and I hope you know how much it means to Marcus and me to see this community come together." Jim looked out at the crowd, families laughing, kids playing, neighbors mingling, and felt a sense of pride he hadn't known he was capable of. "I think I'm finally starting to get it," he said. Angela tilted her head. "Get what?" "What it means to be a good neighbor," Jim replied, his voice quiet but certain. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Jim and Marcus sat on Jim's porch, sharing a bottle of beer. "You know," Jim said, breaking the comfortable silence, "when you first moved in, I thought you were here to take something from me." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, letting Jim continue. "But I was wrong," Jim admitted. "You didn't take anything. You brought something something this neighborhood needed. Something I needed. Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. Change isn't easy, Jim, but it's necessary. And the best thing about it? It's never too late to embrace it. Jim clinked his bottle against Marcus's. Here's to change, then. They sat in silence, watching the stars. Two neighbors who had started as adversaries but had grown into something far more meaningful. Friends. The next morning, Jim awoke feeling lighter than he had in years. He stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper and found a note taped to his door. It was from Alex, the boy he'd mentored. The note read, "Mr. Rogers, thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. I'll never forget what you've done for me. Alex." Jim folded the note carefully, tucking it into his pocket. As he looked out over the neighborhood, he realized it wasn't just the Johnsons who had changed his life. It was the simple, undeniable truth they taught him. It's never too late to start over, to build bridges instead of walls, and to let others show you the way when you've lost your own. For the first time in years, Jim felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The neighborhood wasn't just a place to